Picture this: for decades, Russia had options. Sell gas to Europe, ship oil east, play currencies against each other, and keep everyone guessing. That room to maneuver, those choices, was economic sovereignty. Then 2022 hit. Moscow went to war to stop Ukraine from drifting toward NATO and the West. A hard, strategic move meant to protect influence. But here's the twist: nobody in the Kremlin advertises: the war didn't just redraw battle lines. It redrew Russia's economic map. When sanctions slammed the doors in the West, Russia didn't become self-reliant. It grabbed the only lifeline left: China. Not as an equal partner. As the gravitational center. The buyer with leverage. The supplier that can fill shelves. The financial backstop that can set the terms. If sovereignty is the ability to choose, watch what happens when the menu shrinks to one option. Because once pipelines, supply chains, and payment rails point in one direction, they don't swivel back on a speech. That's the story behind the headlines: Russia tried to keep Ukraine out of the West, and drifted into the East, through contracts, currency, and trade. This isn't about tanks. It's about options disappearing. In early 2022, Russia didn't just launch a military campaign, it triggered an economic chain reaction that would narrow its future. One decision at a time. The stated goal was strategic: stop Ukraine from sliding deeper into Western security structures. But the immediate consequence wasn't only on the battlefield. It was a shockwave through trade routes, banking channels, and the basic plumbing of modern commerce. Within weeks, the West moved with a scale and coordination Russia hadn't faced in the post-Cold War era. Markets that had taken decades to build became politically radioactive overnight. European buyers, the premium customers, started backing away from Russian energy. Long-term relationships turned into liabilities. Contracts didn't just get renegotiated, entire corridors of demand began to vanish. Then came the financial squeeze. Major Russian banks were cut off from key parts of the Western financial system. Cross-border payments became slower, riskier, and more expensive. Even when trade was technically legal, the friction exploded: compliance checks, blocked transactions, insurers pulling back. Shipping companies hesitating, counterparties afraid of secondary exposure. Money could still move, but not freely, not cheaply, and not with the same global reach. And the technology cutoff hit where it hurts most: the future. Modern economies don't run on raw materials alone. They run on chips, machine tools, software updates, industrial components, aviation parts. Precision instruments, thousands of invisible inputs that keep factories productive and companies competitive. When those pipelines get restricted, the damage isn't always dramatic in the first month. It's cumulative. It shows up as delays, substitutions, improvised workarounds, rising costs, shrinking quality, and a slow erosion of capability. On top of that, hundreds of billions in Russian assets were frozen abroad: state reserves, corporate funds, private wealth. The message was blunt: access to the Western system was no longer a given. It could be switched off. Russia didn't just lose customers. It lost optionality. And when optionality disappears, leverage disappears with it. A country can survive a lot, especially one willing to mobilize its economy for war. But survival under pressure is not the same thing as freedom. From that moment, the question wasn't, will Russia collapse? The more structural question was, where can Russia still breathe? And as the exits in the West slammed shut, one door stayed open to the East, wide enough to save Russia from immediate suffocation, but narrow enough to set the terms for everything that followed. Here's the part most headlines miss: Russia's biggest loss wasn't a single market, or a single sanction, or a single company leaving. The real loss was choice. People talk about economic sovereignty like it means standing alone: no imports, no foreign brands, no outside influence. But that's not sovereignty. That's isolation dressed up as pride. Real sovereignty is simpler and more brutal: the ability to choose between multiple options. Multiple buyers. Multiple routes. Multiple currencies. Multiple suppliers. Multiple ways to finance trade and keep your economy moving. Before 2022, Russia had that menu. If one customer pushed for a discount, Russia could threaten to sell elsewhere. If one payment channel got complicated, Russia could switch currencies or partners. Leverage comes from alternatives. It's not about being loved. It's about being able to walk away. Sanctions didn't just cut Russia off from the West, they shrank Russia's menu down to a few items, and then down again. When you lose alternatives, you don't negotiate. You comply. Not because you're weak in a military sense, but because the math stops working in your favor. That's how dependence forms in the modern world. Not through occupation. Through logistics. Through finance. Through supply chains that become one-way streets. And once an economy reorganizes around a single dominant partner, one buyer for your exports, one supplier for your imports, one currency for settlement, you start living inside someone else's gravity. You can still have flags, speeches, and missiles. You can still claim independence. But your room to move is gone. So when Russia pivoted after 2022, the shift wasn't just geopolitical, it was structural. The Kremlin didn't simply choose a new friend. It traded a world of options for a narrow corridor of survival. And the moment survival becomes the priority, sovereignty becomes the price. Energy is where the new reality becomes impossible to hide. Because energy is Russia's strongest card, and even that card started getting priced by someone else. Before 2022, Russian oil and gas flowed toward the highest-paying, most liquid markets. Europe wasn't just a customer, it was the premium buyer. That mattered because when you have premium buyers, you have bargaining power. If one negotiator squeezes you, you can pivot to another. That's what leverage looks like in commodity markets, alternatives. After sanctions and the political break, the geometry changed. Russia didn't stop exporting energy. It rerouted it. And rerouting sounds like freedom, until you realize the pipes, shipping lanes, insurers, and buyers now point in fewer directions. When the number of serious buyers shrinks, the buyer becomes the price setter. So Russia kept selling, but at a discount. Not because it wanted to. Because it had to. If your barrels are stranded, your revenue collapses. If your gas can't reach the old network, your negotiating position collapses with it. In that environment, a deal isn't a deal. It's a lifeline with conditions attached. And here's the mechanism: once you rely on one dominant route, the route becomes a choke point. Pipeline gas is the clearest example. Pipelines don't behave like flexible trade. They're fixed infrastructure, steel commitments welded into the ground. If your system was built to push west, and suddenly west is closed, you can't just spin the valve and send the same volumes east overnight. Building new capacity takes years, billions of dollars, and political stability you may not have. So every existing eastbound corridor becomes more valuable to the buyer on the other end. Oil is more mobile than gas, but even oil isn't free in a sanctioned world. Shipping costs rise. Insurance gets complicated. Middlemen take a cut. Risk gets priced in. And every layer of friction lowers the net revenue Russia collects, while giving the buyer room to demand a deeper markdown. Multiply a discount across millions of barrels a day, month after month, year after year, and you're not talking about small change. You're watching a quiet transfer of value, money that would have flowed into Russia's treasury staying on the other side of the trade. That's energy gravity. You sell cheaper, not because you're generous, but because your options evaporated. And when the pipes and contracts point mostly one way, the bargaining power flows the same way too. So why didn't Russia collapse the way so many forecasts predicted? Because wartime economies can look healthy on paper, at least for a while. When a government pours money into defense production, logistics, recruitment, and state-linked industries, it creates activity fast. Factories run longer shifts. Employment rises. Orders flood in. Salaries and contracts move through the system. GDP ticks upward, not because the economy is becoming more innovative, but because the state is buying output at scale. It's the economic version of adrenaline. The body can sprint even with a serious wound. That's why you could see headline numbers that seemed almost defiant: growth, low unemployment, busy streets, stocked shelves. But those surface indicators don't tell you whether the economy is building long-term strength. They tell you whether the state can keep the engine revving. The problem is what happens underneath. Wartime spending doesn't just add demand, it reshapes the entire structure. Capital and talent get pulled into military supply chains instead of civilian technology. Engineers work on drones and artillery components instead of productivity tools and consumer innovation. Credit flows toward politically protected sectors. Imports that used to upgrade industry get replaced with whatever is available, often at higher cost or lower quality. The economy keeps moving, but it's moving in a narrower lane. And here's the trap: the longer that mobilized pattern runs, the harder it is to unwind. When production is reorganized around war contracts, peace isn't a simple switch. Companies become dependent on state demand. Labor markets adapt to the war economy. Budgets lock in. The system begins to reward compliance and scale, not competitiveness and experimentation. So yes, Russia proved it could endure pressure longer than many expected. But endurance is not the same as resilience. Resilience means you can take a hit and return to balance. Endurance means you can keep going while the internal wear quietly accumulates. That's why the real story isn't sanctions failed. The real story is, sanctions changed the direction of the economy. They didn't necessarily break the machine in one blow, but they helped push Russia into a model that is more militarized, more dependent, and more fragile over time. On paper, adrenaline looks like strength. In reality, it's often the sign that the body is running on borrowed energy. When Western brands left Russia, it wasn't just a symbolic exit. It created a practical problem with political consequences. Empty shelves are dangerous. Shortages don't just hurt consumers, they breed frustration, erode legitimacy, and turn economics into street-level instability. The Kremlin couldn't afford that. So the vacuum had to be filled. Fast. And that's where China stepped in, not slowly, not cautiously, but at scale. As Apple and Samsung vanished from official channels, Chinese smartphone brands expanded into the gap. As European and Japanese automakers pulled out, Chinese vehicles arrived with financing, inventory, and aggressive pricing. As IKEA and other household names disappeared, Chinese-made appliances, furniture, electronics, and everyday goods flowed in through new supply routes. On the surface, it looked like continuity: stores stayed open, products returned, life went on. But underneath, the retail landscape was being rewired. Because consumer markets don't reset like a light switch. They form habits. They build ecosystems. A phone isn't just a phone. It comes with app stores, payment systems, warranty networks, repair shops, accessories, and brand loyalty. A car isn't just a vehicle. It creates demand for spare parts, service centers, diagnostic software, insurance packages, and dealer networks. Once millions of people buy into a particular ecosystem, that ecosystem becomes the default, and switching back becomes expensive and inconvenient. Even if sanctions ease tomorrow. That's the quiet power of filling the shelves. It's not only about selling products today. It's about owning the channels that deliver products tomorrow. Distribution networks, logistics partners, retail contracts, advertising pipelines, those things harden over time. Whoever controls them can shape what consumers see, what they trust, and what they can realistically afford. And there's another layer: pricing and competition. Russian domestic producers were supposed to have their moment. Sanctions would force a wave of import substitution, a homegrown industrial comeback. But competing with China is a brutal game. China has scale, supply chains, state-backed financing, and the ability to compress margins in ways a smaller economy simply can't match. A Russian startup can't easily go head-to-head with a manufacturer that serves a market of over 1 billion people and exports worldwide. So the West didn't just leave a gap. It left a gap that China was uniquely positioned to turn into market share, fast. And once that market share becomes normal, it becomes sticky. That's how dependence grows in daily life, not through speeches or treaties, but through the ordinary act of buying a phone, replacing a fridge, or financing a new car, until, made in China, stops being a replacement and becomes the new baseline. Here's the deeper shift hiding behind all the talk of resilience. Russia isn't moving toward a new industrial era. It's drifting back into an older pattern, one that looks stable, but quietly bleeds power over time. It's the classic resource export model. In that model, a country digs value out of the ground, oil, gas, metals, fertilizer, timber, then sells it mostly as raw input. The money comes in, but the real wealth creation happens somewhere else, downstream, where raw materials are turned into finished products. Advanced machinery, electronics, vehicles, and industrial technology. That's where margins are higher. That's where know-how accumulates. That's where supply chains become strategic assets. After 2022, Russia's position in that chain slid in a way that's hard to reverse. Energy and commodities still move out, but increasingly toward fewer buyers and on weaker terms. And what comes back in, through new routes and new brands, is often higher-value manufactured goods produced elsewhere. In simple terms, Russia sells cheap barrels and basic inputs, then pays more for the complex stuff it needs to keep modern life running. That's not modernization. It's a downgrade in the structure of the economy. Because industrial strength isn't just having factories. It's having the capability to design, produce, and iterate at the technological frontier, machine tools, semiconductors, industrial software. Advanced materials, precision components. When access to Western technology tightens and domestic industry struggles to scale, the fastest solution is importing. And when the fastest importer becomes China, the long-term dependency deepens. Over time, this model changes what the country becomes good at. Talent flows where the money flows. Investment chases the safest returns. If the most reliable revenue is in extracting and shipping raw materials, and the most reliable supply of finished goods comes from outside, your economy learns to specialize in the upstream and outsource the rest. And that has a political consequence. The more your value added sits abroad, the more your leverage shrinks. You can threaten to cut supply, but buyers can diversify, stockpile, or build alternatives. Meanwhile, you can't easily replace advanced imports on short notice without suffering real pain at home. So the story isn't that Russia adapted and moved on. The story is that adaptation is pushing Russia toward a narrower role in the global economy, extractor, not builder. Supplier of inputs, not owner of the high-value chain. And once an economy slides into that lane, climbing back up isn't a slogan. It's a decade-long fight, with capital, technology, markets, and time that Russia increasingly doesn't control. The most revealing change after 2022 wasn't on the shelves or even in the pipelines. It was in the money. Before the war, Russia's trade lived inside the default language of global commerce, dollars and euros. That system gave Russia flexibility. You could sell energy to Europe, buy technology from the West, finance deals through deep capital markets, and move payments through the world's most liquid networks. Even if politics were tense, the plumbing still worked. Sanctions didn't just punish Russia. They severed access to that plumbing. When key banks were restricted and payment routes became unreliable, Russia had a basic problem. You can't run a modern economy if you can't settle trade smoothly. So Moscow needed a substitute. And Beijing had one ready, the yuan. Step by step, trade invoices shifted. Russian companies started accepting Chinese currency for exports, because getting paid in dollars or euros became complicated, risky, sometimes impossible. Banks expanded yuan-denominated accounts. Businesses held yuan reserves, not because they suddenly fell in love with China's monetary system, but because they needed a currency they could actually use to pay suppliers and keep imports flowing. On paper, this got marketed as de-dollarization, a bold break from Western dominance. But in practice, it was something else, a swap of dependence. Because using the yuan doesn't just mean holding different banknotes. It means relying on financial rails China can influence, liquidity conditions, settlement channels, regulatory permissions, and access terms that ultimately sit within Beijing's reach. When your trade is concentrated with one major partner and your settlement currency is that partner's currency, you inherit their leverage. That leverage doesn't have to be used loudly to be real. It can show up as small changes, tighter access, higher costs, sudden compliance hurdles, shifts in exchange mechanisms. Or selective flexibility, offered to friends and withheld from everyone else. The point isn't that China will flip a switch tomorrow. The point is that Russia no longer controls the room in which the switch exists. And this is the structural irony: Russia didn't escape monetary influence. It relocated it. From a system dominated by the dollar and euro, massive, liquid, global, to a system where China's currency and financial infrastructure become increasingly central to Russia's survival trade. That's what yuanization really means. Not independence. Not freedom. A narrower corridor. When your exports, imports, and banking systems start orbiting one currency, you're not just changing how payments are made. You're changing who holds the gravity, and who gets to set the terms when the next crisis hits. For decades, Central Asia was supposed to be Russia's backyard, the buffer zone where influence felt permanent. The language, the labor flows, the security ties, the pipelines, everything leaned toward Russia by default. Anchored by Moscow and the long shadow of the Soviet Union. But power in the 21st century doesn't always move with troops. Sometimes it moves with asphalt, steel, credit lines, and quiet signatures at the bottom of infrastructure contracts. After 2022, while Russia's attention and resources were pulled into the war, China began tightening its grip in the region, not by confronting Russia head-on, but by making Russia less necessary. Beijing showed up with the one thing Moscow couldn't match: scale. Billions in investment pledges. Industrial zones. Energy projects. Loans that come packaged with long-term influence. And then there are the routes. For more than a century, Russia's geography made it feel like the unavoidable bridge between East and West. If you wanted to move goods across the continent, you passed through Russia, or paid a premium to avoid it. But China started building alternatives. Transport corridors and rail links designed to bypass Russian territory and reduce dependency on Russian transit. That shift matters because bridge power is leverage. If you control the corridor, you collect fees, shape trade flows, and gain political weight. But when new corridors emerge, the bridge becomes optional. And optional is the first step toward irrelevant. It's the same logic with energy. Direct pipeline connections and supply deals increasingly tie regional producers and consumers to China, reducing Moscow's role as middleman. Countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan don't have to break with Russia to shift away from it. They just have to follow the incentives. That's the quiet displacement: no dramatic betrayal, no single turning point, just a steady rerouting of money, trade, and infrastructure until the center of gravity moves, and Russia wakes up to find that even in its neighborhood, it no longer sets the terms. So if you're looking for the moment Russia lost, you won't find a single battlefield collapse or a ceremonial document. This is how power declines in the modern world, quietly. It happens through contracts that lock in discounts. Through pipelines that only flow one way. Through supply chains that get rebuilt around a new center. Through payment systems that shift from dollars and euros to a currency controlled elsewhere. Day by day, the numbers start telling a story that speeches can't rewrite. That's the real thesis: an empire doesn't have to be conquered to be constrained. It can keep its flags, its parades, even its weapons, and still lose the one thing that matters most in economic history: options. Because sovereignty isn't a slogan. It's the ability to choose. Choose your buyers. Choose your suppliers. Choose your currency. Choose your route. And when those choices shrink, dependence grows, even if the country looks fine on the surface. Russia went to war to prevent Ukraine from becoming part of the Western orbit. But the war accelerated something else: Russia sliding into a structure where China holds more of the leverage, more of the rails, and more of the long-term upside. Now I want to hear your take. Do you think this is a new kind of vassalage, economic, structural, built for the 21st century? Or is it a temporary arrangement that Russia can reverse once the pressure changes? Drop your perspective in the comments. If this kind of analysis helps you see power differently, through incentives, infrastructure, and numbers, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who still thinks geopolitics is only about tanks.